Hello everybody, my name's Matt Watson. I'm here to talk about accessibility in the web. However, I'm not going to give you a lecture today, although accessibility is extremely important. What I'm going to do is just give a few examples of accessibility issues that can face us all, and just give a few examples and just try and change a few perceptions, things you hadn't thought about before. So just to start off, just to gauge the room, who in here is a developer? Does development work day to day? Any designers in the room? So mainly developers then. That's good. Okay. So then, did anybody here go to Front End North? No? Front End North was an event we ran in Sheffield this year, and my colleague Kim Jones spoke there, and he was telling about selling the front end. One of the things that he came up with is a lot of agencies market on their websites, we will make your website accessible. And his point was, accessibility shouldn't be an optional extra, it should be something that we all do in our day-to-day roles. And it's really not difficult if you're a developer to add a few extra classes, bits of meta, change the order of things to make things accessible. So just a quick shout out, what do you think the main issue somebody that has accessibility issues when reading a website has? Site. So yeah, predicted. A lot of people consider accessibility to be around visual impairment, people that can't see, people that rely on screen readers. And this is very true. However, I'll get to this at the end, but I'm going to talk about all the other things that can affect you first. So people always think it's some kind of disability that people might have, something that affects them. But to give a quick example, I'm not a blind person and I'm not partially sighted. But the other week I was in hospital and I was having some eye drops in. And it sent me blind. I couldn't see anything. I just saw a blur. So I was sat there in the hospital and I sent my mum a text message saying, because she was meeting me in the hospital, I said, they've just put eye drops in. Apparently I'm going to go blind for the next 4 hours. So if you need me, can you call me? So I sat there and she sent a message back. I looked at my phone and I couldn't read it. I could not see a thing. So there I had an accessibility issue that affected me. Fortunately, I've got one of these fancy iPhone things with accessibility features. So I managed to navigate my way into the accessibility settings purely because I'm a bit geeky and I remembered where it was and I managed to put on the zoom. I still couldn't read it, but at least I had a zoom on my phone. And about 3 hours later, I finally read the message which just said, "Okay, love." So, it was a source of anxiety for quite a while, wondering what that message said. But hey ho. So yeah, it's not all about having a permanent disability. So let's talk about touch. I mentioned a few touch issues there. So a good example is you might have lost an arm, either an accident or you was born without an arm. And this is a permanent disability. This will affect you throughout your life. A temporary disability, you may have had an injury, you may have broken your arm. It will get better. But for that moment in time, you're good to only have one arm. Arm. I hope your editing's good. Right then. And the third type, of course, is a situational. And these, I mentioned to Matthew at the start, these slides are quite old. And at the time I wrote this, I did have a young baby. But I've now got a 3-year-old boy. And, and accessibility isn't just about websites. For example, I bought a Google Pixel XL and I sold it a week later. The reason why? I was walking to school with my boy, holding his hand, my phone rang. It was too big for me to swipe. I couldn't do it. So just thinking about things like this and the user interfaces you make, that wasn't fit for purpose for me because I had a situational disability. Not that my boy's a disability by any means, but so if you're considering things like this, if you've got a wider screen phone, You don't want any interactions that might not be possible with one hand, especially now. Phones are getting bigger and bigger. This used to be they were getting smaller and smaller. We're going the other way now. So the next one I want to talk about is motor skills. Similar to touch, really. So this could be... Have I written my notes here? Oh yeah, right then. This could be a young person, for example, my boy. I can give him an iPad and he can work it, but if he's got to do anything complicated like swiping and things like that, he can't really handle that. Or somebody with learning difficulties might struggle with things like this. Or perhaps an elderly person or somebody with some kind of illness that affects their motor skills. And I just wanted to demonstrate this here. And this sort of ties into motor skills and also visual accessibility. Drop-down menus. They're an accessibility nightmare. The reason why? Somebody comes along with the mouse and they're hovered there, but they've got quite a shaky hand, so it's an elderly person, and they've got down to this thing here and they've moved off and it's disappeared. So I'll give another example of why drop-down menus are bad. So drop-down menu, I used to work with a guy, he was partially sighted. He used to zoom his screen in really, really close. I'm probably walking out of frame here, so I apologise. And he would hover his mouse over here, and this would appear, and it would take over the entire viewport of the screen. He could not see a thing because of it. Or worse still, he would be looking at this area, and his mouse would move to the top of the screen, and suddenly it was completely taken over. So drop-down menus are a terrible, terrible accessibility idea. You really need to have something that you make a specific action. Something like I believe a mega menu is the term. You might have heard them called other things, but something where you say, I want to open that, click it, and it opens and shows you the links, and you can close it again. There's an interaction there. It's fixed on the screen. It's not going to disappear when you move your mouse away or whatever input device you're using. And also, you're not likely to trigger it by accidentally flicking your mouse to the top of the screen. Carousels. Does everybody hate carousels? Well, you should. Because should I use carousel.com? Go to that website. Sorry. They pose accessibility issues for people. They don't have to, not if they're wired up properly. But they're a big issue for people. Again, if these things are moving, so if that's in your viewpoint and it's moving on its own, you start reading it, perhaps you're a slow reader, and it's gone, it's moved. So obviously you can make accessibles, can make carousels accessible, having things like don't start it automatically, so have pause, play buttons, don't have the thing going automatically. You can have lots of nice things, but this is a fun website, shouldIusecarousels.com. And if you visit that, then it'll just say no, don't, for those reasons. But yeah. Another one. I said these slides were old. So obviously, click area, talking about motor skills, things like that. Which is the better click area? Is it this one here where you've got to get over this relatively tiny button? Or would it be better to have the entire area clickable? Obviously the second one. So the next one I want to talk about is alternative ways to navigate. So people will navigate your site in lots of different ways. So I talked about people with various motor skills and that. I was talking about a mouse. I was talking about a touch screen. But people use all kinds of things. People might use a trackball. People might use the tab key. People might use a specialist navigation device. Say that they're in, I've seen people use one of those little things that they breathe into the mouth to move pointers up and down. I don't know the name of them, shame on me. Your good old console controller, because people decided it'd be a good idea to put browsers on consoles a bit ago, and they never really worked quite well with anybody's website. So we talked about touch, but we're not quite there. We're not quite about visual accessibility yet. So let's talk about Hearing, audio. So you may be permanently deaf, no hearing at all, or something temporary. For example, you might have a ear infection. I've certainly had one before, which has affected my hearing for a long time. So it could be something that you'll get better from. Or, you could be in a noisy environment, and this will impact you. So, what can you do if your target audience can't hear you? Well, reasons I can think that you might want to hear something is if you're watching a YouTube video. And how can you make that so people can access it if they can't hear what people are saying? Well, you can use a transcript file, and YouTube helps you make that. You can even write a transcript of the video, stick it on your website maybe do both. And this has an added benefit as well, because not only does it mean that people can read what's being said on the YouTube video, and it also has the added bonus that your web browser can index this, so people will be able to find the video, but find content that's relevant to them. You'll notice this a lot if you're a Facebook user. Many of the videos now have closed captions, and that's mainly because they know that people don't tend to be browsing Facebook with the audio on, because the last thing they want is a video autoplaying with the sound block blaring out. So now you scroll down and something's autoplaying, it's got text, and it draws you in. So that's a situational. You don't want the audio blaring out, and this is for everybody else, obviously. If you've got a video on your website, then you can use certain tools. Here's one that creates interactive transcripts. So as your video is playing, it starts highlighting the line that's being spoken. So there's different tools available for things like that. And we talked about a noisy environment, which is a situational problem when you're listening to audio. But another one might be a language barrier. Perhaps somebody's got a really strong accent. Perhaps they're from a different country, or perhaps they're from a different regional area. Perhaps you're not very good at understanding certain dialects. I mean, a lot of people probably struggle with mine. I've got this very Yorkshire accent, and if I was speaking, down in London, people might struggle. They might not be familiar with some of the terms I use. So language can also be a barrier there. So obviously there's things to compensate for this. So my company works with WordPress. So WPML, it's a plugin you install in WordPress, and it lets you translate your site into different languages. So if somebody speaks a completely different language, you could target to them in their language. And I think I've got a couple of slides missing here, but there were some chat ones, but I don't know where they've gone, so I'm just going to skip to the next one. We talked about audio. Text is the next one I want to talk about. So perhaps, sorry, not text, speaking. Sorry, speaking. So perhaps you can't talk. It's permanent. You've got, maybe you haven't got a voice box. Maybe it had to be removed. Perhaps you've got laryngitis and you can't talk for a little bit. Or perhaps again, you've got a heavy accent, so people can't understand you. So there are lots of things already in place for these kind of situations. The web is essentially a text tool at its very core. So things like email and social media, chat things, and I think I remember where my slides were that I thought were missing. So, there's things that you can do to compensate for this, and fortunately the web's already wired up to do it. So here's one. There's a million of these out there, but here's one, Chat Pirate. Live chat with your visitors in real time. So perhaps if your customers aren't comfortable calling you up, because they've got one of these issues, they can't talk, or they've got laryngitis, or they've got a really heavy accent, then, or perhaps, they're good at reading English, but not so good at typing English. You can use one of these tools to live chat. The majority of websites you visit now, people that want to sell you things especially, they've got a little chat thing that pops up saying, how can I help you? And you can engage with them that way. I know a lot of support things do as well. My server company certainly do. So that was the wrong icon, I think, but that was about talking. So the next is readability. Can anybody tell me what this number represents? Probably not. I'll tell you. 9 is the average reading age in the UK. And you never know who will be reading your site. Now, my background is public sector, 8 years in the NHS, 4 years in local government. And something that happens in social care and healthcare is you've got child carers. You've got young people looking after, say, their parents or their siblings, and they do things on their behalf. So they may be going on your website, they may be using your services. Who knows? The Sun newspaper has a reading age of 7. And that's the nation's biggest selling newspaper. So if you read some of the terms that they use, it's aimed at a 7-year-old. And there's a reason for that. It's because not everybody has has the same reading age. And, I think most newspapers, even the, the broadsheets, I think they roughly go for a reading age of 12. So it's still, So how can you combat this in your website is the question that I'm trying to ask. How can you get around this reading age? Avoid jargon. So if you've got a website, and our website is guilty of this, in our website, we've got something that talks about selling responsive web design. Well, what does that mean? It says something like, with responsive web design, we'll make sure your website renders at all screen sizes. What does that mean to anybody? Well, it means your website will look nice on a mobile phone. That's all it means. So why don't we say that? It's something we need to change. So a young person's not going to understand that. Somebody with a low reading age, or somebody with learning difficulties necessarily. And, why use just one word when you can use 10? So I used to work at Barnsley Council, as I mentioned earlier, in local government. And I was in a meeting talking about simplifying our website, reducing jargon. I essentially did this presentation. I told you it was quite old. And the term came up that was being used a lot, local authority nursery units. Can anybody tell me what that means? No? It means nurseries. And I said, why not just say nurseries? And they said, because we've got private nurseries. I said, well, no, why not call private nurseries, and call local authority nursery units nurseries? I lost this particular battle, by the way, and I hope it's much better now. So yeah, nurseries. So why just use 10 words when you could use one? TLAs, 3-letter acronyms. People love these. Here's a few: CSS, PHP, HTML, JS, WCAG. These are just a few. I mean, I could go on and on and on. I've got a few WordPress-specific ones in here, but I'll save you the pain of those. We've got one in WordPress, that's nonce. It stands for number once, and the American developers, we're taught, don't have this issue. They don't realise it means something different here, but it's by the by. It means number once in WordPress. I just thought I'd mention that. So can anybody tell me what this acronym means? EOL. Exactly. On an NHS website I used, it was being used in two different contexts. It meant employee online and end of life. It can be very confusing, so avoid things like this. This is jargon. It's confusing to your customers. It's confusing to people who have got certain needs. So, it's good to know your audience. And how can you help some users? Well, this is a really good example. This is 3 different examples of the same website, the Children's BBC's website. So, CBeebies, it's got lots of lovely icons that suggest what they are. So perhaps if you're not good at reading, you're a young child, you can see that that's a TV and you can watch something, or that's a book and you can read something. And for slightly older children, you got the old CBBC website here with icons. So, TV for shows, a music note for music. So it's aimed at that reading age with some supportive information. And then you've got the grown-up section, which they think that we don't like from icons. So I consider myself a grown-up. Others wouldn't. Also, dyslexia, something I've got. So here's a lovely font called Dyslexia that adds weight to the bottom of characters so they don't float around. You can use that, you can download it, you can use it custom on websites if you have something like dyslexia. Colour blindness. 4.5% of the entire population suffer from colour blindness. So, for example, that would be grey with slightly darker grey if you were colourblind. It's one of the colour blindness. There's several types. And also, make sure you have a good contrast. So, if you're using very, very sort of grey-white text on a grey-white background, people aren't going to be able to read it very well. You think they'd know better, right? Old slides. And you can use something like Snook's contrast checker. Make sure that all your colours are nice and accessible, so you can read against certain backgrounds. And here it tells you the compliance against WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So this green on this black, the colours aren't really compliant, but surprisingly they do pass WCAG AA, which I wouldn't think. It's quite difficult to read for me. So I mentioned I used to work at Barnsley Council, and the slides I'm about to show you are an exercise I did when I worked there. So this is sort of before I got hold of it. Can anybody tell me what that web page is? It'll take you a while to get there, but it's actually about fostering. That's what it used to look like on a mobile device. So where's the content? That's all navigation. So after lots of tinkering, that's a bit better. Don't need all that navigation at the top. We've just got a nice back button. Foster in, and you can read a good amount of the text. Doesn't look like this anymore. I've since had other people in. And that's a mobile device, so it doesn't need to display all the information for everybody. And if you're on desktop, you can expand it out a little bit. So we've got the exact same web page there, and it's slightly different. This isn't talk on responsive web design, though, so I'm not going to go into that. Another example. And behind that website, it rendered like this, essentially. This is a printout of the site. And it was done deliberately so that if you had no styles and no JavaScript, it would read like a text document. And the only thing we needed to do to make it printable is just remove the navigation at the top and remove the style sheets, and away you go, it prints. So it was a deliberate effort. So I showed you the mobile view before I tackled it, and here's what the desktop used to look like. look at all that navigation. So we're talking about people that have difficulty navigating websites, people that, have various issues like that. It's very easy to get lost in all that. It doesn't really, you're on the fostering page there, but it's quite difficult to understand where to go next or where to go for the information before this. So tackling it looks a little bit more like that. I mean, still, that could do with some more work, if I'm perfectly honest with myself. But it's cleaned up much more, and it sort of says what's related within this section. Not fantastic. But tests have proven that people read websites in an F pattern, so that they will glance across the title first and then scan down and read the titles for each subsection and then decide if they want to read it. So the design of that website was deliberately done to sort of mirror that F pattern. And if I can. And also kept in mind the reading width of the page. So issues such as this help all kinds of people. So reading width, if you've got more than, it's 12 words per line, your eyes find it difficult to get to the end of the line before darting around. If you try and read something that's across a long space, it's really difficult. So putting these things in mind when developing the site, so just cater to that audience that might struggle with something like that. That just talks about vertical width. So there's the before and the after. So the next thing, so that was reading. The next thing I want to talk about, I'm still not there on the old visual accessibility yet, is page load speed. So I think this is an accessibility issue we all face every day. I certainly experienced it today on the train here, and when I was sat in the train station before I came here. And I think the biggest factor here is impatience. If people have to wait a long time for your site to load and their connection's poor, they're going to give up. They're going to get frustrated. We've all got very short attention spans these days, I think. And, a poor connection and you're shoving megabytes or huge amounts of data down there to their mobile phone or whatever device they're using, people are going to get pretty impatient. So in the WordPress world, there's certain tools you can use. Here's one called Insanity that compresses images to make them a little easier, a little bit smaller. And then there's Auto-Optimize in the WordPress world. I never asked if people used WordPress in this room. I should have done, really. So that's page load speed. And then you got visual accessibility. So you might be permanently blind or permanently, visually impaired. Or again, you may have an infection, and I really couldn't find any other icons than this same one. Or you might be, driving so you can't look at your phone. Or better still, you might be a robot. What do I mean by a robot? I mean search engines, things like Google. They're a robot essentially. They're not a human. And robots are pretty dumb. We're not quite there at the singularity yet. A robot, it's not going to understand how to read your website unless you give it specifics on how to read your website. So that means things like semantic markup. So, use the article tag so Google knows where your article starts. Use an aside so it knows that this bit's a little bit separate. Use microformats, use ARIA roles, things like this. And this applies to screen readers as well, which are also a robot. So I mentioned a few. Semantic code, microformats to describe what a piece of content does, ARIA roles to alert screen readers, So for example, if you've got something like an accordion, or if you've got something like a carousel on your web page, use the ARIA rules to indicate that this section's hidden and this section's open. If you've got something like a pop-up, you can use the rude alert. I think it's called rude, I can't remember now, to indicate that that this needs attention now. It's taking over your page. So it's things like you can do. Alt text on images, obviously, and never use the words click here. I'll give you an example of why you shouldn't. You need context in links for them to be accessible. And I've used screen reader tools before to sort of test them out against websites. And if you're listening to a website, I think several screen reader tools do this, but you can listen through all the headings, or you can listen to all the links out of context to the rest of the site. So if I'm listening to a website and it says, click here, click here, click here, I'm not going to know why. I don't know what that means, or read more means nothing. So if that says something like, I'm listening to it and it says read more to find out about this latest news article, that's even a bad example because there's no context of that, but I don't know, say the news article's about Tech Talks. So if it says read here to find out about our latest Tech Talks, you know where that link's going to take you. So that's some kind of thing you can use. And it might spoil your layout if you've got a call to action and it's a button that says read more. Well, there's ways around that. You can use, certain techniques that make things accessible only to screen readers. If you use frameworks such as Bootstrap or Foundation, they're built right in. You've got your visually hidden or your SR only. They're just for screen readers. So when you're doing your development, it doesn't take a lot of effort just to put in an extra span with a bit of extra content that describes the thing within the link. My computer's just gone to sleep because I've been talking too long. And progressive enhancements as well. So for example, you might have fancy drop-downs, rotators, animations. Underneath, it's just text. So if your customer doesn't have any JavaScript or they're on a poor connection, don't punish them. Just get it to render without them. Worst case scenario, you've always got the classic no script tags. Find out why you should always have descriptive links in your text thing. You should never ask people to click here. That's a really bad example of contrast. I want to talk a little bit about Target, US Target. They were sued for $6 million. And the reason why is because they decided to have an offer. And what they did was they had certain deals on and they put little sale icons next to the pictures. And they did this kind of thing. Probably not that icon, and probably a lot prettier than that. And the issue was they didn't put any descriptive text. So people that were using screen readers, they couldn't see that. So they couldn't take advantage of any of the offers. I don't think anything on that scale has happened in the UK. That's a unique thing to the US market, but it's an issue, and we should at least consider our customer needs. So what's the upshot of using these fancy tags and making things more progressive? The upshot is better SEO for you. These dumb robots are going to be able to read your site much better, the same way that somebody using an accessibility tool can. So if you think that you're doing this for a reason, which is, I want people to view this link in context and understand what it's about, not only that, but those keywords are getting shoved into Google too, so they know that that link that you're linking to is related to those keywords. So, and better ability for screen readers to help you out as well. So there's a few slides in here about why we use WordPress at our agency as a back end, and I know there's a lot of love out there for WordPress, but there's a lot of hate there too. So I'm not going to harp on too much about it because you're not the right audience, but it does run 28% of the web, and it's got a focused accessibility group. So anybody in this room, if they chose to, could join in and contribute to WordPress and the accessibility. You can test areas of it. You can report bugs saying this is not accessible. And they've got a dedicated team, and they're fantastic. They knock down loads of issues every release. And the good thing about WordPress as well is the themes that come out of the box, they've been tested against all the accessibility standards. That's some upshots about that. So, the most popular question I get asked at the end of this, I've put in here, what if my boss won't let me implement these features? So some of you might work in a large organisation where your boss doesn't care, doesn't think you have the time. Or your boss might be your direct clients. You might be a freelancer or an agency. So what if your boss doesn't let you? Well, you got to choose your battles really, and you won't win every one. And sometimes this carousel that you really want to dissuade your clients from using, they'll really fall in love with and want to use it. And that's fine, but make sure that you have identified issues such as perhaps this doesn't work well, perhaps this doesn't meet WCAG, and make sure that they have to accept that decision. So they are aware of the accessibility issue and they have to accept it. So your conscience is clean, you've done it as best as you can to make it accessible. And a lot of time, if they realise that the ownership of that risk or that issue is on them, they might soon back down because it is, after all, a legal thing. It does. You do have to comply with the Disability Act. So just to go to the point I opened this with, accessibility should not be an optional extra. It should be something embedded into what you do. So I'm going to try a little experiment now. I want you to put me in a situational environment where I'm not going to be able to hear the audio on the next slide. So thinking back to not be able to hear at all, to having an infection so I can't hear, or a noisy environment. Can you make this a noisy environment? Yeah. Yay! Thank you very much. Very cheesy, I know. Does anybody have any questions? So testing processes are tools that we use on our clients' websites. We use tools such as, there's one called Total Validator, which you buy and it basically crawls the site and identifies accessibility issues. There's some Google tools, I can't remember the name of them and I'm going to embarrass myself, but you can check for microformats, things like that. There's colour contrast checkers such as the one I identified there. In fact, the Total Validator tool I think also does that. And you can use some good old SEO tools as well. So Screaming Frog, silly name, but that will identify certain things too. So yeah, there's lots of tools available. And if you haven't got access to those, you can always use the WCAG website. That's got a built-in one page at a time. In fact, they've got a service now where they will do your entire site, I believe. So yeah. Anybody else? So for the camera, the question was, how far do we go when we build our client websites? We strive for AA or higher. And when we're building our sites, we build them in a modular way. So we use GitHub and we'll define a feature, and then there'll be testing criteria for that feature. And one of the testing criteria is, does this component match WCAG? So say we've just built, I don't know, something like we've just built the footer or we've just built the navigation. Then we'll get that on a page and run it and say, does that pass WCAG? If it does, great. And then we'll pass it and move it on. So we make sure that every element has been thought about. It's got microformats on it. It's got ARIA roles, and the JavaScript, CSS. We didn't build our own site like that. It was hacked together, but we will solve that. It's a good question, actually. It's something I've never thought about. So the question there was, do we have any way of checking if anybody uses the accessibility features? And as I've said no, and the reason why is because when we put something out there, I lost track of what I was going to say there. So we put it out there so that search engines can take advantage of those features and things like that. But in terms of people and using them, I'm not actually aware of any tools, and I'd be very interested if you knew of any, and that'd be really good. I think it'd be good.
Being realistically, to satisfy the legal requirements, you know, it doesn't matter if it was one person using it or 10 million people using that feature.
That's a fair point, that, you know, it's to benefit everybody out there. Although I think from a statistics point of view, it'd be interesting. Not that you wouldn't make things accessible, but you know, you wouldn't use it to sort of sell accessibility. But I think it'd be just interesting to monitor it. So the question was, do we use testing with real clients and choose where to focus? Again, because we don't specifically build purely accessible websites, they're just for the client, and we get the client involved in user acceptance testing and whichever peer groups they want to involve in that. So, you know, smaller organisations might just be the person that's commissioned the website. Larger ones might have a group of stakeholders. And it really depends who's in that group. So we send it out there and we get them to test it, and if they accept it, great. And a lot of the time with the smaller agencies, because we don't, smaller companies, because we don't treat the way we build a website differently from one of the smaller guys to one of the large corporations, they won't know we've done this, and that's fine. We know that we've made it accessible. Some of the larger organisations, for example, public sector such as a council, they will have somebody, usually from equality and diversity, who will be specifically testing for these areas. So NHS certainly would. Well, not certainly would likely have somebody from their equality and diversity area. So yeah, it would get tested, likely with screen readers.
Matt, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you.